we have to Dockerize our application, otherwise it will work only on our PC. If you remember, we have created a to-do list application. Let us start it to see if it works. So do you remember this command, mvn spring boot run? And yes, it works. Actually, if you take a look at here, my application is listening on this port. However, if you clone this application, it's really probable that this application will not start on your machine. Maybe because you have not installed Maven or you don't have the Java version that I'm using. So I need to Dockerize my application, to containerize my application using Docker in order to make it portable. So when you clone my application from GitHub, for example, you should just have Docker engine and then everything is ready for you. So in order to Dockerize your application, first thing you need to do is to create a file inside the demo folder, so exactly where your application is, and call it Docker file, exactly with this syntax. So capital D, Docker file. And then you need to add a base image. So this is the image that Docker will download from internet and then will put your application on top of this base image. You need to tell Docker that it needs to put the created file, the jar file that you have created from your Spring Boot inside Docker. And then you need to expose this port 8080 in order to let others communicate with your application which is running inside Docker through this port. And then you need to put the command to run your application, which you need to run the Java command in order to run the app.jar application. And let's check something. Let's check at first if we have any jar file inside our target. If I click on target, I don't see any jar file. But why? Well, because I have not packaged my application. At first, I need to create a package for my application. In order to do that, you need to run this command, mvn clean package. Let's run it and let Maven to create the package for us. And here it is. The package has been created for us. This is the jar file. Now let's run it. Let's see if we can really run this. We have the jar file here. So let's run it, java -jar, and what's the name? It's demo 001 snapshot.jar. If you don't like this naming, you can change it in the pom.xml. And yeah, it worked. So I can run the package that I have created. Great. So now let's see if Docker can create an image out of this application. So in order to build this image, so in order to build the image, the Docker image of your application, your Spring Boot application, you need to run the build command. Let's name our application as to-do list, and let's tell Docker that it can find the Docker file here. It failed. It says there is no Docker file in this directory, of course, because we are in the target directory. Sorry for this mistake. Let me get back. Let me run this one more time, and failed. It says there is no Docker file in this directory. Oh yeah, because the Docker file is not in the demo directory. It's in the YouTube directory. My mistake. Let me put it like this. Okay. Now let me run it one more time. And now Docker has started to create the image. Okay, great. Docker to-do list has been created. Let me check it. Docker image list. Okay, we have the to-do list. This is the latest version. Now let's run our image. So I use this, so I will say Docker run. The network should be my host network because I would like to let the Docker image inside this container to communicate with the database that is installed on my machine. And the map port 8080 to 8080. Oops, it didn't run. Probably because it cannot communicate with the database. Let's verify. Yes, communication failure, JDBC, com.mysql.cj. So somehow the application inside the container cannot communicate with my database. It's strange because my application in the application that I have packed could communicate with MySQL. Let me try it. Yeah, as you see, I actually can communicate with MySQL. However, my application inside the Docker container cannot do it. So let's discover why. Okay, so I'm not able to communicate with the database, but why? Let's take a look at the command that I am running here once again. So in this command, I'm not passing any environment variable. So the URL of my database here is localhost. So I'm telling the application inside the Docker container to connect to the database with the URL localhost. However, localhost of my Docker container is the Docker container itself, which I don't have any MySQL database there. This is why I cannot communicate with the database. When I want to let the Docker container to communicate with the database that is installed on my machine, instead of calling localhost, I should pass the environment variable MySQL host as Docker internal localhost. So here it is. I should actually tell Docker that instead of connecting to your local host, connect to the local host of your host, which is my machine. So passing this environment variable will guide the application inside the Docker container to call the correct local host, which is my machine local host. Let me run the application. And as you see, right now I'm able to run my application. So let me one more time show you the command that I have passed. So here it is. As you see, I am passing the environment variable MySQL host as host.docker.internal. And like this, I can communicate with my database. Okay, great. However, my application still is not 100% portable, because what if you don't have a database on your local machine? Then if you download this application, you have to install a MySQL on your local machine. So it seems only Dockerizing your MySQL, your Spring Boot application is not enough. You have to somehow provide MySQL as well. This is where we need to use Docker Compose. So let's see how we can use Docker Compose in order to provide database as well. So in order to have everything together, so my Spring Boot application and my MySQL, so my database together, what I should do is to use Docker Compose. In order to use Docker Compose, I create a Docker Compose.yaml file here. I put the version of Docker Compose that I want to use. By the way, if you don't know what is Docker Compose, leave a comment, so I will make a video also on what is Docker Compose. And then I have to create my services. The first service that I will create is the Spring Boot application, which is inside demo app. And inside this demo app, actually there's the Docker file that creates my Spring Boot application. And then I have to create the MySQL service, which is my database. So in the Spring Boot application, I say that my application depends on MySQL. So I have put the name here MM MySQL, so MySQL, in order to make a difference between the name of the image and the name of the service. And I say that Docker Compose should at first bring up the MySQL service, and after that it can bring up my application. And then I need to connect this application to the MySQL application through a network. So like this, these two applications can communicate together through this network. if I don't connect them through the same network, these applications are not able to communicate to each other by default. Also because MySQL by default do not accept any communication from outside of its network. After I've connected them through the same network, I have to create the network as well. So I should say, I should ask Docker Compose to create me also the network. And the other thing that I need to remember is that the port that I use for MySQL should be equal to the default port of the MySQL, and it should not be the port that I have mapped inside. So when you create the MySQL container, you map a port of, so the outer port of your Docker container to the default port of MySQL. And usually it should be different from the default port of MySQL, because if you have a MySQL running in your local machine, doing so will save you from the conflicts. However, when you are communicating to the same network of your MySQL Docker container, you have to call the default port because you are inside the same network. Okay, great. So now let's see if I can bring up everything together. To do so, I have to do Docker Compose up and -- build. Let's see what will happen. So it pulls the stuff, it is creating MySQL image. Let's see what will happen. So as you see, the Spring Boot application is not able to communicate to the database. It doesn't find the database. If you look at the error, it will tell you that unable to determine the dialect JDBC, and if you go a bit upper, you will see the error. So access denied for user root. So your MySQL is giving the access denied. It doesn't allow your application to get connected to MySQL. So how can we solve this issue? Well, first of all, you need to stop your Docker Compose, and you should bring down your application. By the way, I am not doing Docker Compose in the detached mode. I stay attached to the Docker Compose because I want you to see the logs. Okay, now I need to give the possibility. So I need to let my Spring Boot application to connect to the database with this user and password. And yeah, here it is. This is the issue. I have forgotten to use the password root. So the root password is root. Let me use the same password. So user root, password root. So the root password should be root. Let me bring up my application again. And yeah, here it is. Now my application is up and running. So right now, Spring Boot application is able to communicate to the MySQL that I just brought up with Docker Compose. Let's control it. Let's see what do we have here. Let me open another terminal and let me perform a Docker PS. And as you see, we have the MySQL application, and we have we have the Spring Boot application, and we have the MySQL, our database, the containerized database, and they are communicating to each other. I can even call my application and see if I will get results. So let me use Postman and let me perform a GET request. Okay, I'm getting some answers, and for now the database is empty, it seems. So let me create a task, practice 1. It is completed. It seems I have created a task. Let me perform a GET request, and here it is. I've managed to get the task that I have created. So My application is working. However, there is an issue here. To show you the issue, let me bring down my application. Okay, I've stopped everything, I removed everything. The issue here is that I am using the root user in order to communicate with the database. This is not a good practice in production. You don't want to let your application to communicate to the database through root. Each application should have its own username and password. So let me use my user Saman because I already have asked MySQL to create this user. Let me use Saman and Saman1234. And let's see if my application right now can communicate to the database or not. Let me run the application, and now the application is able to communicate also with this username and password, Saman and Saman1234. Now let's see if I have access also to the database. Something that I here need to tell you is that I already have mounted a file named db. As you see here, it has been created, this file. I have mounted this folder to the default directory of MySQL. So now I expect to have all of the data that I have created previously. Let's see if I have access to them. Let me perform a GET request, and yes, I have access to it. Let me see if I can create a new task. Wait, I can create tasks and I can get them. This is it. So something that I wanted to show you here is that how really these things are working. So how my application knows where is the database in the Docker Compose and what really are these username and password as environment variables are doing here. How am I injecting them into my application? So if you have seen the first video that I have discussed the to-do list application, in that video, I have explained the application.properties here that you see. I said that this is a syntax that let you to define or an environment variable or use a default value if the environment variable is not specified. So here, the environment variable that I am defining for my Spring Boot application, for the URL of the database, I am passing MySQL host as the environment variable. If it's not defined, then use the localhost, I am telling him. And then I am defining the MySQL port, MySQL user, and MySQL password. And these are exactly the variables that I am passing as environment variables into my Docker Compose. For the MySQL host, whenever inside the Docker Compose file you have services like this, the URL for your database actually is the name of the service. So for MySQL host, I have to call this MMYSQL. For MySQL user, so I'm using the username and password that I have passed here. And for MySQL port, I am passing the default port of MySQL. Again, I repeat, when you are in the same network with your database, you have to use the default port. You should not use the mapped port. And passing these environment variables in the Spring Boot application already has this application.properties, and we'll search for these environment variables and we'll find it because Docker Compose will create the container with these environment variables and put the correct values. And this is why your application can connect to the database. Another thing that I wanted to tell you is this restart always. If you see, both in my Spring Boot application and in my MySQL service, I have put this restart always, which means if there is an error in any of them, restart the application. It's important because sometimes your service might go down due to some technical issues. You might even see it when you run it on your local machine. For example, there are situations that a Spring Boot application needs to get restarted sometime before being able to connect to MySQL. These issues can happen because of some delays in the communication, or sometimes when MySQL is, for example, you might have, for example, lots of data in the DB, and MySQL might need some time in order to load all of those data inside the DB volume. Because of these issues, Spring Boot might fail to connect to MySQL at first, but then this restart always will let the Spring Boot to restart itself and gets connected. And also your DB, if it fails, this restart always will ask Docker Compose to restart the container that MySQL is inside it, and your application will be up and running again. Thank you so much. I hope you have enjoyed this video. If there is any question, please write me in the comment. Thank you.